Hello, my fellow strawmen, and welcome back to the Fields of Hay. Today I wanted to address someone who isn't an apologist per se, but who is a very popular political and social commentator who openly relies on his religious beliefs to form his opinion. You all read the title. It's Ben Shapiro, our friend from the Daily Wire. I'd be amazed if he sees this video from my tiny little channel, but to anyone who will listen, I want to take the time to explain why I don't think Ben understands much of anything about atheism, and why he has bad reasons for ruling it out. Our first clip comes from a talk he did at the University of Utah.
To my central argument, whether you're an agnostic or an atheist, the bottom line is that without the belief that there is a purpose to the universe, without a belief that there is a purpose to your life, without a belief that you have the capacity to make individual choices, it's very difficult to build a civilization. By difficult, I mean impossible.
Just this short clip already has so much to dig into. First, and perhaps most egregious, is that he never references atheism or agnosticism in his reason as to why they are wrong. He just assumes the connection between atheism and a lack of purpose, and assumes the impossibility of believing in free will as an atheist. But he offers no reason as to why such positions are necessitated under atheism. If you'd like an example of what that'd look like, I agree with Ben on the first point that there is no purpose to this universe. That is because purpose is derived from intent, which is derived from mind. And since a mind did not create the universe under an atheistic worldview, then the universe could not have a purpose. However, at the scale of your personal life, there is a mind which can decide a purpose for you, your own. It's called subjective purpose, and I think it's enough to give people hope and a drive to be productive members of their communities. Sometimes the journey to find your purpose is long and difficult, and sometimes it gets cut tragically short, and sometimes you never find your purpose. And as saddening as that is, it's the best we've got. If it's true that there is no God, then believing in a divinely derived objective purpose is just misled. And so I don't want to believe such a thing until I have a good reason to first believe in God. This brings us to the fact that Ben doesn't even care about whether God really exists. He cares about the usefulness of the belief, about whether a civilization can be built on it. I can understand the sentiment of wanting to leave something lasting for future generations, but logically it's an entirely irrelevant point. Ben claiming that atheism is false because you can't found societies on it is a complete non sequitur. In fact, it is little more than his incredulity that he founds these claims on. He doesn't understand how an atheist could believe in purpose or free will, which I'll come back to in a moment. He doesn't understand how atheistic societies can be successful. Of course, if this incredulity doesn't invalidate his argument enough for you, there's the counterexample of the Scandinavian countries, which are incredibly peaceful countries with high standards of living, and are majority atheist and agnostic. He is outright wrong to claim that civilizations cannot be founded without belief in a god. And even if he were right, it wouldn't help us to know whether such a being is actually in existence.
Okay. So on that note of free will, which is what you're talking about, right?
Yes. I think free will, by the way, is the single most important principle undergirding any civilization.
I think that Ben is getting at the idea that if you want to enforce moral laws, then people ought to be accountable for their actions, which is only true if we at least think that we have free will. And I agree, if the general public doesn't see themselves as being morally accountable, but instead as slaves to their whims, I do think that the rule of law would become incredibly difficult to enforce. But we don't need a version of free will in which we are ghosts in the machine, some ethereal decision-making beings that overrule natural law to make our bodies act according to our will. This libertarian version of free will I certainly see no evidence of. All we need is compatibilist free will. We just need a reason to say that people can be accountable for their decisions, and we do. If we are just bags of meat, as Ben likes to put it, then those bags of meat are the ones making the decisions. They aren't overruling the laws of physics to do so, but instead use the brain states caused by their genetics and their experience. Ultimately, if you switched out one meat bag for another, it could very well make different decisions, and so the actions taken can be attributed to that particular meat bag. What Ben doesn't seem to be grasping is that I am my meat bag. And so if that meat bag makes some decision that other meat bags wouldn't have been forced to take, then that decision-making bag of meat is the one accountable. I am the one accountable. It doesn't require a soul or God, but it is enough to run a civilization on.
Free will, by the way, is the single most important principle undergirding any civilization.
Okay, absolutely. And to be totally honest with you, I'm torn on the subject myself.
Yeah.
And which is why.
But in your own life, you're not, because you chose to come here and you chose to ask me a question, right?
It's complicated.
I would hate to think that the universe randomly imbued you with a set of atoms that showed up here randomly to ask me a question. That would be very disappointing to me.
So now to address the point Ben has implied several times, that atheism necessitates that free will doesn't exist. Lucky for me, the audience member asking Ben questions foreshadowed this quite nicely when he said,
in my opinion, I feel like you strawman a lot of atheist arguments.
In this case, the strawman boils down to calling atheism random. No acknowledgement of properties of matter, no recognition that matter can naturally behave in consistent patterns. I hear no more than incredulity that such things are possible under atheism. Ben implies that the set of atoms that make me up were arranged randomly in my worldview, but I'm fully aware that such a thing is ludicrous. If there are trillions of molecules in even one of my cells, the probability of such a cell spontaneously forming by atoms randomly bumping into each other is practically nil, to the point where I'd expect such a thing to never happen. Luckily for me, random chance is not the reason I think I've been imbued with the atomic arrangement I have. What I believe is that abiogenesis must have formed something much simpler than my modern eukaryotic cells, something which could at least in part be accounted for by random chance. Then the iterative process over billions of years that we call evolution can account for the complexification of living forms, and eventually the impeccable placement of so many atoms as to form me. And as to whether my actions are random, as I mentioned earlier, it matters not if my decisions are formed by matter or spirit. My being a meatbag doesn't change the fact that there are reasons why I do what I do. Some of them are survival instincts I must listen to, such as the drive to eat and drink. Some of them are genetic, such as my tendency towards introversion, just like my parents. Some of them are rooted in my memories. For example, I played soccer as a child, and I still enjoy watching the game. But all of these influencing memories, all of these tendencies, are not disconnected from me. They are a part of me. They define me. So for Ben to suggest that under my worldview I have no culpable control over myself, but just randomly follow wherever physics determines I go, I find it to be incredibly reductive. It focuses too much on the fundamental workings of my mind, and in doing so ignores the emergent properties dependent on the whole system. He fails to see consciousness under the worldview he is trying to internally critique. He fails to see it as a complex process of the brain whose mechanisms we only barely understand. So no, Ben, neither my actions nor the makeup of my being are entirely random.
So my favorite argument for God's existence is that I believe in free will. Okay, the reason that I think this is an argument for God's existence is because if you believe that human beings are essentially just balls of meat wandering around aimlessly in the universe, the kind of Spinoza's stone that thinks that it was moving of its own accord but actually was thrown, if you believe that and you don't believe in free will, then there's an internal coherence and logic to it. If you believe that you have the ability to make independent choices, that you can actually supersede your own biological drives and the environment around you to any extent, even to the smallest extent, this means that you believe in something that can't actually be proved by science, but that you are living every single day.
Like I said earlier, I believe in the compatibilist version of free will. The thing I identify as me is making the decisions. It doesn't matter if at a more fundamental level my mind is acting in accordance to the laws of physics. At the end of the day, I am defined by my genes, my environment, and my perception of that environment. So even if we can break down my decisions to the genetic code or how my neurons process sensory information into a subjective experience, those mechanisms are still a part of me, and so it doesn't take away from the fact that I'm making the decisions. Ben seems to think that the concept of free will requires superseding one's own biology, the ghost in the machine version of free will. It is a very narrow-minded view for him to take when trying to critique atheism, and one which I think speaks to his own biases more than it does to logic. If I'm this Spinoza's stone, I'm not pretending that I can influence myself in a supernatural way. I simply acknowledge that my actions are unique to me, and that other stones would behave differently, thus making me responsible for my actions and they for theirs.
And the notion that you have that will, and not only that you have that will, but that that will is capable of comprehending the universe around you, that your will is sort of, your ideas, your ability to comprehend the universe is a reflection of a reality, of an objective truth that is out there.
And again, we hear nothing but a pile of incredulity. I don't claim to know how subjective experience is derived from the laws of physics, but neither do I see a problem in lacking that knowledge. Yet Ben here claims that there can't be a way for us to comprehend reality without that comprehension being a reflection of some other being. He utterly fails to back this claim up, instead just jumping to his conclusion.
That says to me that there is a God, there's a common source that stands behind that objective truth and stands behind the mind that can comprehend that truth.
Ben catches himself because he realizes that this is an argument at best for a source of comprehension. It doesn't mean that that same source also created the universe, gave us moral laws, and so on. It doesn't mean that a God exists. Ben's favorite argument for God doesn't even conclude in a God. But setting that issue aside, even saying that God is the source doesn't fix the problem. If the problem is, where does our comprehension come from? Then using God as an answer only kicks the can down the road. Now we can ask, where does God's comprehension come from? And the theist can make up some answers about God's nature, not realizing that those same answers could be plausible explanations for why we need no source in the first place. The fact is, the question of the source of free will and comprehension is a made-up problem with a made-up solution, when the whole time we in our evolutionary histories are our own source. So to Ben's argument, I do agree with him that there is a common source, but I have no reason to conclude in a God when evolution is a perfectly plausible candidate which requires no extra assumptions. Now, since these short clips from Ben's channel don't really have time to get deeper into the argument, and there isn't much more on his channel, the next few will be from a conversation he has with Alex O'Connor on Premier Unbelievable's channel.
The principal disagreement that I think I had with you, Ben, is that there was a subtle, or not so subtle, implication, in my view, that yes, with no God there's no free will, but somehow having God can solve this problem. I mean, you said a moment ago that you don't think you can establish God's existence through reason alone, but assuming that you do believe in the existence of free will, you think it's a real thing that you have.
Yes.
And simultaneously saying that if there is no God, then free will makes no sense.
Yes.
That does read to me like an argument for God's existence, such that in order to either say that there is free will, in order to say that there is free will, one must believe in God. And that does strike me as an argument for God's existence.
I mean, to slightly curve that, or to kind of sand off the rough edges there, I would say that the argument I made is an argument for something extra natural.
Sure.
Now, you can call that God or not God, but the thing that I'm making the argument for is that you cannot get from a materialist Darwinist universe to free will. That is not possible.
As I was saying in the last clip, Ben's argument does not conclude in a God. And while I'm willing to agree with him that there must be some source to our comprehension and apparent free will, I don't see why that source must be beyond the natural. In other words, why is it impossible for it to be merely natural? That reason of impossibility is what I'm looking for in this argument, hopefully something beyond Ben's personal incredulity.
So I know that the way you solve that is that you say that there is no free will.
That's right.
And what I'm saying to you is you don't act that way.
Given the context of the video, I believe Alex and Ben are talking here about libertarian free will, the idea of a being overruling the physical body with their mental will. And while I think compatibilist free will exists, I'll agree with Alex that no libertarian free will does. To me, it's clear that the definition bakes in a supernatural idea of a ghost in the machine. And so while there would certainly be evidence for the supernatural, we first need to demonstrate such free will exists. Ben attempts to do this by pointing at Alex's, and I presume any atheist's, actions as being incompatible with materialism. He says that we don't act as though there's no free will. But he says this with no way of knowing how one ought to act if we have no free will. He doesn't explain the material laws and how molecules come together in the body to demonstrate how the perception of free decision-making is impossible under such a worldview. So far, all I'm getting is Ben's incredulity that we could comprehend, ponder, or decide things in a purely natural reality.
To get back to the nihilism point, which you kind of put aside, so that means that this conversation is essentially worthless in any sort of real sense. I mean, effectively, we were driven here by evolutionary biology and environment to have this conversation. Everybody who's watching this is driven by evolutionary biology and environment to have a particular reaction to that thing, and ever round the cycle goes. That seems like a very purposeless life.
I don't see why our conversations need to be so worthless. We are shaped by reality itself. What more could you ask for? Through a long, complicated, and not entirely random history, we came into being, and we are capable of so many things, from thinking rationally to experiencing emotion to being curious. I don't know why any of those things need to be thrown out just because there isn't a God. Doing so would feel childish to me, like I were a toddler that didn't want to play with any toys out of spite for not getting to play with the one toy I really wanted. And furthermore, this reductionist method that Ben is using to toss out evolution and the environment, I could do the same to him. I could say that in Ben's worldview, he is merely driven by his sense of self and the plan he thinks God has laid out for him, and so there is no value to his actions. But doing this doesn't mean that these things can't hold meaning to people. It just means that they don't line up with my personal values, and that's no method by which to establish truth.
I would argue that, again, most scientists speak in the realm of teleology literally all the time, and they're borrowing language from the language of teleology, even when they're describing functions of particular body parts, right? The heart pumps blood in order to keep you alive, right? They're constantly using language that's teleological in nature.
Yes, and this is because evolution can select for organisms who function in ways which are beneficial for the propagation of their species. This selection for biological functionality can superficially appear incredibly like design, and so the language is borrowed, but it doesn't mean that life is designed by an intelligence. It just means that when people try to think of a good word to use in a situation, they're very liable to borrow a word with a similar meaning. It's just a limitation of language, not an indication of hidden design.
The real question that I have, and this is what goes to the question that you were asking at the beginning, before the sort of pre-question question, which was the good of religion to society. One of those goods is people believing that their free will matters and this actually is a useful thing. So I believe that it is deeply important for people in society to believe that they have the capacity to change themselves and to make different decisions than what biology would drive them to.
I was in agreement with Ben right up until he added the part about our decisions having to be different than what our biology would drive us to do. I do think that I have free will, that my decisions have consequences which matter and that I can be held accountable for. And I do think that if I want to change something about my life, I can. Right now, I'm working on brushing my teeth better, because I've been awful about it in the past, but I've managed to motivate myself, and I really have been better about it this year. It's a small example, but it's enough to counter Ben's point that belief in self-improvement and accountability are inconsistent with atheism, because I believe in those things, and I'm about as strong an atheist as you can get. The problem I have with Ben's line of reasoning is that he is starting with this libertarian definition of free will, which bakes into it a presupposition that there is this extra immaterial layer to our decision-making. But there is no reason why this is the version of free will which we must base society on, nor is there reason to think that such an immaterial layer to reality exists. Compatibilist free will is enough. Individuals can agree to it as a common basis for the expectation of moral accountability and rule of law, and it makes no assumption about what things do and don't exist.
And I don't think that most people who live purposeful lives, even if they believe that everything they're doing is predetermined by the world around them, by their own biology, I don't believe they actually feel that. They have to engage in what they themselves would term an illusion in order to feel a sense of purpose and meaning in their lives.
Of course, but that's what the evolutionary process, in my view, in my worldview, I should say, has done so well, is provide precisely that illusion.
And this point I think Alex answers perfectly. I don't believe that there is anything such as objective purpose, but I do believe one can find a subjective purpose for themselves, and in a certain sense it is fair to call this an illusion. Purpose isn't something which exists out in reality, it's just something we make up. I think Ben is trying to point to this and say, hey, this is a complex function, and if people just randomly exist, you wouldn't expect them to have this sense of purpose, this drive to find meaning in their lives, despite thinking such meaning doesn't really exist. So acknowledging that we need some mechanism other than random chance to explain this drive to find purpose, Alex points out the entirely natural possibility of evolution. Our ancestors have, for millions of years, been a very social species, and this can account for the incredible selective pressures on our brain that could lead our species to having incredibly complex minds. Having the desire for purpose would be very helpful in helping individuals to integrate into their tribes, and could thus be selected for. With this possibility still on the table, there simply is no reason why we must invoke a god.
Well, if we can call the self just a deciding being,
call it a deciding being,
then that sort of fundamental assumption that we make about the nature of the self, I don't think is going to be incompatible with atheism.
How so?
First, I want to address the length of the pause before Ben asks, how so? I think it's a clue into how he's thinking. See, in logic, there is always the burden of proof if you want to demonstrate that two things are incompatible. We start with the possibilities that the self is either entirely physical or it has at least some immaterial component. All Alex says is that he doesn't think there's any reason to take the first option off the table, and it baffles Ben. He's incredulous that Alex doesn't just throw the possibility out without reason. Ben should have responded by telling Alex why materialism alone is insufficient, but instead he just asks Alex to explain why it isn't. It's one of the clearest tells I can see in this video that demonstrate how little consideration Ben is actually giving to a possibility he doesn't want to be true. Ben has built his worldview on assumptions and intuitions, and as long as he continues, he will find it very difficult to understand the perspectives of those he disagrees with. And even though the burden of proof is not on me, I would be happy to explain why I think it reasonable to believe that the self is entirely physical. Every experience of my sense of self is correlated with my physical body. It is as though my thoughts are between my ears, and my eyes are the windows I look out of. If I filmed my day, I would see that the parts missing from my conscious experience correspond to when my physical body is asleep. And if I stub my physical toe, I feel the perception of pain. With the immaterial being as unfalsifiable as it is, and with a complete lack of evidence in favor of it, there simply is no reason to think that physical materialism is insufficient.
Because we're talking about what the self is here. I mean, atheists believe in the self. Everybody believes in the self.
Well, no, that's not. I mean, that I find difficult to believe. Why would an atheist believe in the self? The self is a series of non-deciding mechanisms, as you've described.
I have two problems with Ben's response here. First, he seems to think that because individual molecules don't make decisions, then physical bodies made up of only material molecules couldn't make decisions either. But he fails to understand that emergent properties exist. This isn't even a worldview thing, it's just a fact. For example, sand can flow like a liquid, even though every individual grain is solid rock. In a similar fashion, neurons or clumps of neurons can make decisions, even while the molecules from which they are made cannot. Second, another thing Ben finds incredulous is that atheists could even believe that their self is a thing which exists, here defined as a being which makes decisions. I want to be clear that I am a living counterexample to Ben's conclusion, and a perfect demonstration of why incredulity is not reliable. I'm the kind of atheist who will say that God doesn't exist, and I do believe that I exist as a decision-making entity. In fact, it's the first word in what I consider to be a brute fact. I experience reality. The I is my recognition of my sense of self, and it certainly makes decisions. Right now, it's thinking through the possible words and deciding on which ones to write and in what order to write them. I can't even say that my brute fact is a presupposition because I can defend why its negation should be rejected. If I tried to believe that I do not experience reality, then that would include within it the belief that I do not experience my thoughts. This is because either my thoughts are real, or if not, then the thoughts causing the hallucinations I think are my thoughts are real. And on we go, until at some point there must be something real which I am perceiving as my thoughts. So then, in order to think that I do not experience reality, I must experience the thought that I do not experience thoughts. This is blatant cognitive dissonance, and so I reject the possibility that I do not experience reality. Therefore, I do experience reality, and my self exists. Now, this version of self is just the subjective experience of my own perceptions, but one of the things I perceive myself to do is to make decisions, so the difference in definition is a minor point here. At the end of the day, as an atheist, the fact that I believe in my sense of self is one of the most fundamental things I have in my worldview.
I see that your view of the self is an atheist view of the self, a meatball wandering through space, as I've put it somewhat colorfully, the sort of Spinoza idea that you're a stone that's been thrown, and you can comprehend that you've been thrown, but you're a stone that's been thrown, and that's just the way that it is. Why would there be in atheist philosophy such a thing as a deciding self? The deciding being is external to the idea of an evolutionary cause, because the very word deciding suggests uncaused decision making.
Let's say that again, but slowly. Deciding suggests uncaused decision making. Not deciding implies caused decisions. Not deciding implies decisions. Deciding implies uncaused decisions, according to him. Ben is quite literally just inserting this assumption that to have a deciding self, there must be this uncaused, extranatural ghost in the machine that gives you libertarian free will and demonstrates the likelihood of God. Ultimately, I think what Ben is missing in this analogy is that the stone has some influence over where it gets thrown. Maybe the memories it has and the values it holds were formed without the stone's intent, but if those or other aspects of the stone's sense of self are factors which can influence where the stone is thrown, then that's free will. If it sees a patch of ground that reminds it of a scary memory, and has some control in ensuring it gets thrown the other way, that's free will enough for me, regardless of the decision being parsable into reason beyond the stone's control. So long as the stone itself is still the nexus of all the influencing factors that result in some decision, it matters not that some of those factors are external to the stone, or even that all of them are ultimately external. So to solve Ben's dilemma, we can have the free will that societies can be founded on by accepting compatibilist free will, which we know of no reason to reject. On the other hand, libertarian free will makes an extra assumption about the existence of something beyond our material bodies, and would thus be disfavored by Occam's razor. There is no reason to either infer a god or panic about our civilization falling apart. And as far as Ben's comment on decisions being external to evolution, I have no idea what his basis is for that claim. Decision-making skills can easily play a role in an organism's survival, and can thus absolutely be selected for by evolution. All I can say here is that it doesn't seem like Ben is steelmanning the evolutionary position.
So I can't explain to you how the uncaused self makes decisions.
Well, then I can't explain to you how the uncaused self exists on an atheistic
But you have a
framework.
burden and I don't. Meaning that
I don't think that's the case.
You do, though. I mean, the simple fact is that you are the one who's claiming that a reasonable materialist universe is the cause of all. And so if that's the case, you do have to explain the mechanism in a way that I certainly do not.
I want to be absolutely clear about my position. Yes, I am a Gnostic atheist, and I would defend the position that the materialist universe is sufficient as a cause for all. However, I would only take this position through my argument of ice. Only after concluding that God doesn't exist would I infer materialism as the most likely explanation. In this video, I am not referring to ice. Ben's argument about free will is entirely independent from mine, and if it is flawed, which I think it is, then I should be able to rebut it without any reference to my own positive claims about reality. In that spirit, I have taken the position throughout this video, not that I am convinced that materialism is sufficient to explain things like free will and our mostly reliable comprehension of the world around us, but simply that I see no incompatibility between materialism and free will. Don't forget that at the beginning of this video, Ben said that
the thing that I'm making the argument for is that you cannot get from a materialist Darwinist universe to free will. That is not possible.
That is a claim, and Ben has a burden of proof to demonstrate it. It should be a massive red flag that he's unwilling to carry this burden.
My entire philosophy rests on the positing of an entire realm of things I don't understand in terms of their interaction with the world. Now, as I said at the very beginning, that leaves me a giant escape hatch. I'm not going to pretend that that's not a giant escape hatch. It acts in practice as a giant escape hatch. It also tends to act as a fundamental principle of faith.
I don't have a problem with there being aspects of reality you don't understand. We're all human, and nobody has all the answers. My problem with this is that I can say the exact same thing about natural mechanisms. For example, I don't know how consciousness or the perception of free will arises under materialistic mechanisms, but that doesn't mean such mechanisms don't exist. Similarly, if Ben wants to say that he does not understand how God interacts with the world, I have to grant him that that's not a reason to believe God to be non-existent. My only problem with this whole reasoning is that while I have to assume that materialism is sufficient to explain the subjective experiences we each have, believers must make the same assumption that something immaterial is sufficient to explain our subjective experiences, as well as the additional assumption that such immaterial things exist in the first place. It is an entirely extra assumption that I don't have to make, given the plentiful evidence we have for the existence of the material. Again, taking the agnostic stance in this discussion, I would only push back against Ben by saying that there is no evidence that forces us to accept the supernatural, and without such evidence, Occam's razor would tend to point in materialism's favor. And faith. If you've watched any of my videos, you probably know my stance on faith. I can use faith to equally justify any position at all that I would like to hold, including many mutually contradictory positions. It is therefore a method which is incredibly unreliable at coming to truth, and if you find that your beliefs rely on faith, it may be a good idea to rethink them. Need a starting place for that process? Go and read a fucking book.